This conference will now be recorded.
Okay, so welcome to everybody to this the CPSG webinar series, a monthly series, and this month we're delighted to be able to focus in on invasive species and take an opportunity to kind of flag up awareness of, if you weren't already aware, of the guidelines, IUCN guidelines on planning for invasive species management on islands. And I'm delighted to have Dr. Alan Tai here, who's able to give a bit of an overview of those guidelines, share a little bit of his experience of planning for invasive species work on islands, and then open it up for questions and comments from others. Some of you on this call are going to be more sort of perhaps don't spend much time planning specifically around invasive species. Others may be more invasive species, but not do much planning. And hopefully between us, we're going to have a number of comments and questions that we can raise as we go through the talk and at the end. And in terms of raising questions or comments, if you're not familiar with GoToMeeting, there's a chat box, a little speech bubble up on the top right-hand corner, which if you click, you can then enter your message, and you can actually decide to send it to everybody, or you can send it to me or individuals. And as we go through the presentation, it would make sense for any comments or questions to be in the chat box, and I can then respond. And if it seems appropriate, then we'll interrupt Alan to ask the question or make a comment at that point. And then at the end of the presentation, you can carry on using the chat box for questions or comments. But I think I can also reasonably easily see everybody on screen, so you can also then unmute your mic, and I'll then cue you up as I see microphones that are unmuted. But during the talk, we'll stick to using the chat box and keep your mics muted. Great to see some cameras coming on and seeing some faces rather than initials. And Alan, I think I'll hand it over to you to give a bit of an intro to yourself, and then we'll get started on the presentation.
Okay, well, hello everyone, and I'll start with a bit of a disclaimer that this is the first webinar I've ever presented, so there are bound to be hesitations and lost threads and technical glitches, but I hope they fall short of a total crash. I rely on Jamie to put things right if they go wrong. I'm doing this webinar because of my involvement with producing the guidelines, as Jamie mentioned, the IUCN guidelines on planning and management for invasive species. I've worked my whole life in ecology and conservation, starting off with birds and then more on plants, including conservation of threatened species and habitats and management of invasive species, and then increasingly on higher level conservation management and planning. And along the way, this included managing major invasive programs in Galapagos, the Pacific Islands, and the islands of the Western Indian Ocean, which is basically my claim to be able to do this sort of thing. As part of a role in the Pacific, I had to produce a regional Pacific invasive species strategy. And the Pacific Island countries and territories are mostly small, obviously, and they realize the value and necessity of collaborating, and they've become very good at doing stuff together. So there are plenty of regional strategies in the Pacific on everything from fisheries to tourism and governance. But the Pacific's also a good example of the limitations of large-scale strategies, because they often just get put on a shelf because no one is really responsible for implementing them. So despite the fact that many institutions are happy to go along with producing a strategy and even commit to some actions in it, at heart they know that if they eventually fail to come up with the goods, it won't really matter because none of the other participants will meet their commitments either. So there's a huge tendency with strategies to come up with wish lists. And because of that, I think we have to treat strategic planning, particularly at high levels, with a degree of skepticism, and I'm quite aware that I'm talking to CPSG members here. I'm a member of the CPSG myself, but we have to remember that planning is just a means to an end. It's to achieve a management goal. But anyway, this skepticism of regional strategies in the Pacific led us to asking people there what kind of document they would actually use and not just file away. And what they told us they really wanted in the way of planning for invasive species management was not so much a strategy, but a guide on how to produce a plan or a strategy, especially at individual island or island country scale. So that is the Pacific Regional Environment Programme that I worked for at the time, produced this. Where are we?
Alan, just as you're starting off, would it be all right to have your camera on, and then people can put a face to the name as well?
It is on.
Oh, is it?
There I am.
Oh, I'm not seeing you. Maybe turn it off and on again. It may just be me,
okay, wait a minute. If I do that, you'll just have to bear with me a sec while I.
So I'm supposed to be helping you as opposed to creating problems for you. Probably doing quite successfully.
Okay, camera's off, and let's see, back on. It's now locked. I think the camera's locked because the meeting is using it. So
okay,
we may be stuck with that one.
Don't worry. We'll worry about that afterwards. Let's get started on the talk. Thank you.
Can you see my screen now?
Yeah. Yes, and now it's gone to full screen. Perfect. Thanks.
Yeah. Okay. So that's the Pacific guidelines for invasive species management in the Pacific, which we produced in 2009, and it was a reasonable success. Countries actually did start to use this document as a planning guide. So later on when I came to manage what was then a faltering regional invasives project in the islands of the Western Indian Ocean, which was also tasked with producing some sort of invasives manual, we recognized that there was already plenty of guidance available on how to manage various kinds of invasive organism, from ballast water to ballast water stowaways to plants and rats. We couldn't hope to contribute anything comprehensive along those lines, so we actually carried out a survey across the region to ask people what sort of guidance document they'd find useful. And once again, almost all the respondents favoured some kind of guide to planning and prioritisation and support raising. So we took the decision to update and amplify these specific guidelines, at the same time changing the emphasis somewhat, and this is the result. So this is an updated, a bit bigger, it's about 50 pages, global version of the Pacific guidelines. And although it still says islands in the title, it's actually applicable to invasive species planning anywhere. It's aimed mainly at the programmatic level. So how do you put together an objectively prioritized strategy and action plan for an invasive species program at national level or island level or departmental level or even at protected area level? Basically, you can use it whatever kind of invasive species planning you're doing. So having expressed some skepticism at the value of strategic planning, here we are talking about how to do it. But you might have noticed that I just said strategy and action plan. And the crucial point, of course, is translating the strategy into action. So, Alan, yeah, carry on.
Sorry, just I think it seems for a number of us, it seems to be your screen seems to be flickering on and off. I don't know whether you're experiencing that.
No, it's stable here.
Okay, so what I might do is I might actually just share my screen and then see if and then you just either go quiet when you want me to move forward or tell me next. Is that okay?
Sure.
I'm not quite sure why that's happening. So I'm just going to take you off that. And then I need to bring up the talk myself. Apologies for this. I have no idea why it's doing that. Okay. I'm just going to share my screen and bring that up. All right, let's advance through. Oops. So that's where we're up to. Can I just check with perhaps if Kirsty, could you turn your mic on just because I can't see everybody just now? Can you just tell me if this is no longer flickering? Is this stable on your screen? Is it looking at it?
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah, that seems stable now.
Perfect. Thank you. All right, Alan. So if you carry on, and then I say either just say next or go quiet, and I'll assume that it's time to move on. Cool. Is that okay, Alan?
Yeah, I was kicked out of the meeting, so I rejoined.
You're having all the fun, aren't you, this time? All right. Okay. So we're on that same slide. Hopefully you can see that too.
Yep, I can see that. Yeah.
Great. So do you want me to advance?
Let me just check where we got to. Yeah, just go to the next one, please. Yeah. And I need to make it so that I can see more than. There we go. Yeah. Yeah. This was the process that we used to compile the new guidelines. We did it in the most consultative way we could manage within the 2 years that we had available, mainly using invasive species networks, regional ones and global ones, and a couple of workshops. Could you go to the next one, Jamie? Great. So basically, the guidelines are a practical working document. I've put words here on this slide in red to indicate some of the principal objectives of producing it. As I mentioned, they're mainly for programmatic national or agency level planning. And one key objective was to make such plans realistic and not just a wish list. Go to the next one. Therefore, pretty much anybody who's developing an invasive species program, and not necessarily on islands, so I put the word islands in brackets there. They're for government agencies developing programs and international or regional agencies that may be assisting them, and you can use them, of course, at individual department level or NGO level too. Next one. And above all, it's a practical working document, and there are two major sections, the checklist and then additional guidance on a few areas that people told us were especially important or problematic, especially planning objectively and realistically and choosing achievable goals, raising support and overcoming opposition. So the key words throughout really are objectivity, realistic, and feasible. And the whole document is aimed at the process of trying to make plans as objective, realistic, and feasible as possible. Go to the next. So if we look at you might have to click on this, Jamie, as we go through, just to make the next bit of the screen appear. So let's start off with a look at the checklist section, which is the main tool for making the plan as objective as possible. The checklist covers all the aspects, or all that we could think of invasive species planning, research and management. And the basic elements, the foundations that you can see here, that are needed before you can do anything at all. Foundations includes planning and decision making, generating support, building capacity, legislation, policy and protocols. And generating support isn't just financial support, it's generating awareness and cooperation amongst the local people, and also raising support among other government departments that might be competing for funds, that sort of thing. Just click on this on the next. There you go. There's this. That's the second section of the checklist, which looks at the research aspects of managing invasive species, all about information and prioritization, establishing a baseline of information, prioritizing species, pathways and sites for management, and carrying out the essential research that might be needed to be able to carry out that management. Click again. And then the third main section of the checklist is on management action itself, right the way through from biosecurity, prevention, through managing established invasives to restoration after management. And just go back to it. Yeah, I'm getting a bit lost here. With the important thing with the very last point there, I think the C3 post-management restoration is that it embodies the principle that you're not just writing a plan for the sake of it. You should never write a plan for the sake of it. You write the plan as a step to achieving a management goal. And in the same way, when we're managing invasive species, particularly as conservationists managing invasive species, we're not doing that for the sake of it. We're doing that in order to achieve another goal, and to protect or restore some value, whether it's biodiversity or an economic value or cultural value or something else. So post-management restoration's a key part of the process, and it's one of the things that often gets forgotten from invasive species plans and management. Click on the next. So just to give you an example of how the checklist looks, this is just an example page from the checklist to show you how it's structured and how you use it. Each theme has a number of objectives, and within each objective there are a number of actions that you might or might not do depending on your priorities in order to achieve the objective. Next. So how you use it, you can use it as basically as a checklist and tick the actions that are relevant to your plan. Just click a couple of times, Jamie. And again, that's it. So go back. Sorry about that. There you go. So you may, for instance, in this objective, you may already have in place invasives checklists and surveys and monitoring at key sites and things like that. Or somebody else might be doing that other than your own agency. But you may want to identify pathways of introduction and develop models to predict future invasive species problems. And the checklist's main purpose is really to make sure that you don't forget anything, and that if you leave something out of your plan, you do so deliberately. So you've considered it and decided it's not important for you, rather than leaving it out because it simply didn't occur to you or the people writing the plan. So the checklist basically is an aid to memory and to avoid a planning workshop just making a list of pet projects of the people who turn up. It's to make people think more broadly and increase the objectivity of the plan. Next. So the second major section of the guidelines document is this how-to part, where we try to tackle some of the fundamental issues that virtually all invasive species practitioners face. And we narrowed it down to three main areas of concern: how to raise support and deal with opposition and inertia, how to write and prioritize a plan, so how do you make the prioritization decisions, and how to translate the plan into action, because if you don't do that, then the planning has been a waste of time. Next. And again, the how-to sections are practical guidance. On this slide, there are some page examples which we can come back to later to examine in a bit more detail. Click again and you show a couple more pages, Jamie. And another one, there you go. So those are just, I'll bypass that for the moment and come back to it later. Go to the next. I think we may have skipped one, but never mind. If you want to, yeah, go next. Okay, never mind. I hope most of you have already got the PDF in whichever language version you want. There are English, French and Spanish versions in PDF, and there are English and French versions in hard copy. And if anyone wants hard copies, just let me know and we can arrange to get them to you, probably free. You skip to the next slide, Jamie, and you'll see there are the links for the download. But again, if anyone can't manage to get those down right now, they're on the IUCN website, or just ask me and I'll send them to you. Go to the next one. So this was going to be the end of the first part of the presentation, and a chance for people to ask questions before we pass on to the next topic. Jamie asked me to look in a bit more detail at the guidance for generating support and improving engagement and overcoming opposition. So we'll come back to that. If anyone has any questions at this point about the way the guidelines work and the overall structure, please do ask now, and if there's nothing, we'll just pass on.
Thank you, Alan. I thought I would just come out to the sharing option so we can then see people. So if you do have any questions or comments, clarifications for Alan just now, you can either write them in the chat, or please also turn on your mics, because I can see your mics and then we can queue people up. And whilst you have a think about that, I've got a few questions I'd like to ask. One of which, Alan, is you sort of separated out the garnering support for the project from the planning part, at least within the guidelines and how it was laid out there. And I just wondered, in your experience, to what extent does support for the project is support for the project achieved through the planning process that is developed? Is there very much a sort of a blurring of those two, or is it something quite distinct that happens in advance, in your experience, in advance of the ground being set for planning to take place?
I think there's a couple of levels involved. One is if you're thinking of a strategic plan in the first place, which will list a number of projects that the country or the agency wants to do, then obviously the strategic planning process needs to be as participatory as possible, with representatives in the workshops, in the planning workshops, from all of the stakeholder groups, if you like. But then when you come to individual project planning, that's really where the community engagement comes in, to make sure that all those affected by the project really get a say in how the project's carried out. So it's a programmatic level and a project level. And just to emphasize that the guidelines that we've been talking about are really for the programmatic level, not so much for the project level, because all kinds of project planning guidance is already available for different kinds of projects, whether it's RAP management or weed management. You can find lots of documents to help you with that. The guidelines are for the higher programmatic strategic level planning.
So that would be your sort of regional level planning as you were doing in the Pacific.
Not necessarily. Not necessarily. It could be an individual environment department planning, for example, where the environment department is expecting to carry out a number of projects in the country or on an island or whatever. But the department needs to put together its own prioritized plan for the next few years. What are they going to spend their money on? So that involves choosing projects, and you'd expect the stakeholder groups to be involved in that process, as well as in the lower level process of actually making sure that the project gets implemented. So two different levels of involving people outside the immediate sphere of invasive species management.
Okay, thank you. And Sarah, did you have a question? Your kind of mic flickered on and then off again. Sarah Pinto, did you have a question you wanted to ask? I'll presume not. And Ivo, yours also, Alves. Did you also have a question you wanted to ask, or was that just a flick of the mic switch? Okay, then Alan, we'll move forward. But one question I did have is, which relates to what you just mentioned in terms of kind of making choices, I suppose, at that programmatic level. With the work that's going on, I think it's particularly in Australia around looking at costing, building kind of costs into projects and making choices based on an understanding of costs and sort of the bang for your buck. So how many species could one save for, X million compared to half of X million? And I wondered whether within the guidelines or within your experience, you've kind of sort of used those sorts of tools to help groups make decisions around where they should focus their effort, or bringing in the financial consideration. Is that already in the guidelines, or is that something separate? And have you had much experience about that?
Yeah, it is in the guidelines. It's part of the prioritization process, and there's a whole section of one of the three how-to sections is really on that, how to make the decisions involved with putting together a plan, and that involves mainly how do you prioritize, really. So you're prioritizing projects according to the resources available to you, or that you realistically think you could get, in order to make the plan as successful as possible. You don't want the plan, as I said, you're not really looking for a wish list. It's too common to get wish lists which are unrealistic. They depend on resources that you don't have at the moment, and really there's no real possibility of getting those resources during the period of the plan, so you end up failing. So the whole point of the how-to section on this is to encourage producing a plan that you can carry out and show that you've been successful at the end of it, rather than setting targets that are just way out of reach, which just disappoints everybody.
And that also kind of that speaks to the point which one often grapples with within helping others to plan is encouraging people to be quite explicit around the criteria they feel are most important. And this sort of ties up with objectives as well. And I think within structured decision making, they actually talk about, fundamental versus means objectives. What is it that's a bit, as you're saying, Alan, that, you control the species in order to do something else. We write a plan in order to implement something. That's not the end product. And so helping people to be very explicit around ultimately what it is they're wanting to achieve and what is most important to them in that achievement. Is feasibility the number one variable, or is it cost, minimizing cost, that is really important and needs to be factored into the decision making? There's a lot of discussion that I imagine goes on in this area as it would elsewhere around teasing apart what's ultimately you're trying to achieve from some of the steps along the way to get there, and then what you care most about. in ensuring that the plan is actually one that kind of achieves success. So having those conversations around the criteria that one is using, that the group feels is most important, which may well not be biological. They may be cultural, they may be to do with cost, they could be to do with other things as well.
Yeah, there's a small section in the guidelines on how to make difficult decisions about prioritizing, because particularly within invasive species management, there tends to be pressure to do something about the big problems that everyone can see are affecting lots of farmers or other groups. Whereas you may not have the funds to be able to make a substantial difference in a big problem such as that. Whereas, and what you really need to do is focus the funds you do have on something that where you can achieve a goal. It might be eradicating a newly arrived invasive species or something like that. And there's a political aspect to that, obviously, because politicians at all levels want to be seen to be doing something about big problems. And to some extent that has to be resisted, and resisted in a way that you can back up with strong arguments. And the how-to section in the guidelines on this gives some guidance as to how you would go about that, convincing the politicians that you don't have enough money to do this, but with the budget that you do have, you would be able to do X, Y, and Z. So it's an important part of the planning process to get the plan realistic. Obviously, that's the main objective.
Fantastic, thank you. Shall I share the screen again and go back to the presentation, Alan?
Yes, do that. We might have a bit of a problem because I was going to switch to a PDF of the guidelines at some point, but go back to the presentation and we'll just take it from there and see how it goes.
Cool.
So just click on the next slide then. Right, so just showing that again, click again, Jamie, and most of it will disappear. Because we wanted to focus on the A2 here, which is generating support. So it's partly about raising awareness, but not only about raising awareness. It's more about support than awareness. Awareness just leads to generating support, and the support can include funding for action, but it's other kinds of support that you need for implementing the projects too. Click again. So there's a whole how-to section on that. That's one of the three. Before we move beyond this slide, that middle section there, number 2, is the one that has what we've just been talking about in it, and we can come to that later if we have a bit of time. But let's start with the engaging building momentum and support. Click again. Oh no, go back. Sorry about that. This is the point where I was going to switch to the PDF of the guidelines. Can you try sharing, or let me share my screen and see if it works this time?
Okay, I'm going to pass it over to you, the presentation. Great, we're seeing your screen and it's, oh, I was going to say it wasn't flickering. It's definitely there now. It's not flickering just now.
I'm just trying to get it myself. Maybe it's flickering because I'm trying to get it myself. No, it doesn't seem to be. Yeah, unfortunately, this doesn't seem as though it's going to work. Can you see my screen?
Yes, we can see the how-to page.
Oh, you can. Okay, I can't.
All right. Yeah, no, we've got that page up there with the three statements on there from engage, build, momentum, and support.
Yeah, how can I manipulate this if I can't see it myself?
Now you've gone beyond my limited capacity. Maybe I'll turn to everybody else on the screen who may be better equipped to be able to do it. But I wonder, Alan, is it something that we could do now, or is it something that we could, when we're taking some questions at the end,
Let me just, yeah, it might just be taking some time to come up. What I was going to do was to run through some of the sections of some of the subsections of the how-to on raising support. It's not going to show on the screen, I think. Well, it shows to you, but not to me, so I can't move about to go through this. What I can do is just talk through it and hope that we can manage to get some discussion going. If I can't, it's not showing me on the screen what's happening here. So there's no way that I can move. If I do this, does it? Ah, wait a minute. Now I've got it. No, it's being extremely slow. I think possibly because all the memory is being occupied by the meeting itself. Anyhow, I'll just go through the main sections and hope that somehow we can develop some discussion around these. So the how-to section on building momentum and support and engagement and reducing opposition and all those aspects of support raising begins with the awareness. How do you raise sufficient awareness amongst the community to be able to motivate environmental stewardship, particularly invasive species management in this case? So so there's some guidance on that, and among that, some of the we've given as examples some of the key awareness messages that are important to take into account if you're talking to members of the general public about invasive species. And one of my little bugbears is the word alien. To most people, aliens are from outer space, and hardly anyone in the general public associates the word alien with invasive species. Invasive species itself is bad enough. Nobody really understands what that means. You have to use words like pest or weed instead of invasive. So really the important point made there is you need to think about the language you're using with ordinary people. And there are several other key messages that are mentioned in the guidelines, including which species are introduced and which are native, because most people don't know. What are the impacts of invasives and what benefits come from managing them? Again, most people have only a vague idea about that unless they're farmers. And the idea that introducing invasives doesn't increase biodiversity. Sometimes you come up against that argument. What's wrong with invasives? They're increasing biodiversity. But biodiversity is a global concept. Introducing a common species from somewhere else doesn't increase global biodiversity. It can actually reduce it by causing extinctions of endemics. Obvious to us, but it's something that often you need to put into arguments for planning invasive species management. But one of the main sections in the how-to guidance on raising support is the other side of raising support, which is dealing with opposition. So there's a whole section headed difficult customers, how to overcome resistance on conflict of interest species or unpopular management techniques. Invasive species management basically involves killing things, which is distasteful to most people, including most conservationists. So you may have to develop arguments that overcome that kind of resistance. And the key points are really persistence. It can take a long time to do this. It can take years to get over community opposition to a project. So you have to have patience, persistence, and you have to develop personal relationships with the individuals that are the key people within the stakeholder groups, and show a lot of sympathy and understanding for their points of view, because um, there's no point trying to do a project if you can't overcome serious opposition to it, and you probably even have difficulty raising funds for the project because donors hate controversial projects. So this is a key issue, and there's a little bit of guidance in the it's only a couple of pages in the guidelines on this, but hopefully those couple of pages put across the key points that need to be taken into account. And there's a flow diagram. If anyone's got a copy of the guidelines with them, there's a flow diagram at the bottom of page 17, which
We seem to have lost Alan altogether. Alan, are you there? Where has he gone? This is proving fun, isn't it? I wonder what has happened to him. Alan, come back to us.
His PDF was flickering a little bit too on the side, and I'm just wondering if we've lost him because of his connection.
Yeah.
I mean,
I'd like to say that he was still sort of stuck in some very, very small island in the middle of the Pacific, but he's actually in England at the moment. So,
which is a very small island in the middle of the North Atlantic.
Well, I think Alan needs to change his internet provider. That's what I think. It's obviously not very good. But, oh, Alan, is that you back again? Alan?
Hello.
Hello, you're back again.
I don't know at what point I got kicked out.
So I have actually got up on the screen where, which others can see as well. You were talking about difficult customers, different sections in the guidelines. Do you want me to move on to anything in particular, or should we move on to the case study?
How far did we get before I was kicked out?
You were talking about the difficult customers. And you're also talking about politics and the need to try and engage groups there. Yes, but I got up to this section here on difficult customers.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, at the risk of repeating, I suppose it's difficult to know without knowing how much you've already heard. But there's if you go down a bit, Jamie, on the next page, there's a flow diagram which is taken. Yeah, it's taken from a paper by Anna Noah and colleagues and simplified a bit, that shows the process that you'll need to go through if you're dealing with a controversial project that's potentially generates opposition. And at the bottom right of that diagram, there's your last resort, which is legal solutions if you can get almost everybody on side. It's essential to get almost everybody on side always, but if there are still a few serious opponents, you may under some circumstances be able to get that dealt with by legal means, but so obviously that's a last resort. Nobody really wants to resort to enforcement, but occasionally it's essential. So that couple of pages there really deals with how do you overcome resistance on conflict of interest species and or conflict of or problematic management techniques. It's brief, but we hope we dealt with the main points. We can either stop there and go back to some specific examples of where this has happened to show how people dealt with this kind of problem, or if people would rather, we can carry on going through the how-to sections of the guidelines. I think that's probably up to you, Jamie, to judge the mood. Which way do you think we should go?
Yeah, I think flicking through the PDF is a bit more challenging for everybody to follow, and it can make one feel a bit sick when you're whiz through pages. So I think it would be better to either take some questions or to move to the last few slides where you had your illustration, your example.
Okay, have a question opportunity, and if there's nothing much, we'll go back to the presentation.
Okay. Great. So does anybody have any particular questions or comments they'd like to raise at the moment? But hopefully some of you, if you've been through relatively recent training with us, then one of the points that will be in your mind is the role of the person who's driving this forward, and is this the role of the person who's helping to develop the planning process, or is this somebody involved in the project? The strong sense I'm getting, the way Alan, you're describing it is very much, you want to see this through, you want to get people behind you, but this is a perspective from somebody very much within the project who's looking to get it designed, get it done, and they have a vested interest in what comes out the end. What distinguishes that from the sort of role that CPSG will often play, and others who are coming in to help facilitate the process, is to maintain that sense of neutrality. And obviously, one's not staying neutral if you're saying, well, we're gonna push through regardless. This perspective, I think, is coming from very much within the project. I
don't think, even within the project, I don't think you ever say we're going to push through regardless. Right. That's really fatal. Yeah. You have to spend, a couple of the examples that we talked about before, Jamie, that we can talk about now on in the webinar, are illustrations of programs or projects that really you can't push through. You have to have the community on side. So if you like, we can go back to the presentation, and there's a couple of illustrations that we can use to get us into a discussion of that.
Great. Okay. Okay, hopefully you can see your Galapagos Islands.
Yes. Okay. There's one example before we get to the Galapagos. There's one example actually cited of this in the guidelines itself. It's from Lord Howe Island, the rat eradication on Lord Howe Island, which took years before it could go ahead, because it had to get the whole resident community on side before that could be done. And initially there was a lot of opposition to rat eradication. Now, I wasn't involved in that, but I was involved in similar problems in Galapagos Islands. So we can talk about those, and if other people want to throw in their experience, that I'd be interested to hear more stories of this kind of thing. So for those who don't know, that's where the Galapagos is. There's a lot of islands, but 5 of them, and 4 of those 5 are among the most important for biodiversity in the whole archipelago. They're 4 of the largest islands. They've got they're high islands, so they've got the whole range of vegetation types, which means that they're much more diverse than the smaller islands. And they're highly threatened by human activities on those islands, particularly the introduction of non-native species. So go to the next slide, Jamie. And the 2 examples that I thought we might talk about a bit are this one, which is plant eradications, where we absolutely needed full cooperation of the landowners concerned, because this shows a section of the main island Santa Cruz, which is one of the 4 islands that has an agricultural zone on it. A lot of people don't even realize that people live in Galapagos, never mind that there's agriculture there, but there is. And the agricultural zones are all across a swathe of the highlands of the 4 islands, each of the four islands that are inhabited. This map shows the distribution of 5 introduced invasive species, really incipient invaders, because they are invading, but mostly still only within the agricultural zone. And the idea of this project was to try to eradicate them completely from the island before they could spread into the national park, because most of that island and most of the archipelago is national park. In order to do this, we needed the cooperation of the landowners, the farmers who own the land within the agricultural zone of the island. And in a couple of cases, there were only a couple of landowners that had these species on their farms. So it was a case of talking to them and getting them on side. And basically, with small projects like that, there are a whole lot of species that we could have chosen to try to eradicate. And we started with some of the easier ones, where the landowners were basically cooperative. But the green one there, Citharexilum gentry, which is a tree, was spread over quite a lot of farms. As you can see, it's the most widespread of the species shown there. And we needed to, this was an eradication program, so we needed to get all of the landowners to give us permission to remove the trees on their property. And that took a couple of years of persuasion. I mean, some of the landowners were ready to let us in there straight away, but others were not. And eventually we did manage to get them all on side, but it took, we had to get to know them as friends, basically. We had to go out drinking with them and talk about their problems, adapt the project to a degree to take care of their worries about herbicides being used on their land. The techniques we used were as environmentally friendly as possible, but they did involve herbicides rather than uprooting trees, because the use of targeted herbicide application is less disruptive to the environment, can be, than physical uprooting of trees. So we used a method that involved injecting herbicide into the trunk of the tree, which really minimizes the impact on the environment of the whole program. But we still had farmers who didn't like the idea of using the Spanish word for that's commonly used is veneno, basically poison. They didn't like the idea of poison being used on their land, and we had to convince them, and it took a long time, that it was okay, starting small, doing a little experiment, showing that it worked, all that kind of thing you can do to try to get people on side. The Citharexilum project was going fine. In fact, all of these projects went very well, and three of those species were eradicated. The other two, I'll just stick. The two problematic ones were the first two on the list there, Aristolochia and Citharexilum. Citharexilum is the better example because it was bigger, and in that case, two of the farmers had been originally cooperative, or we convinced them to cooperate, but then the field team had to get into their land to do the operation, obviously, and the farmers became upset because the field guys were trampling their pastures, and as they saw it doing too much damage, so they refused permission again. And that's how the project stands at the moment, but we haven't given up. And really, we're hoping to get those farmers back on side in the future, but for the moment, the project's been shelved. So it made a lot of progress, but it's been held up by the kind of problem that we're talking about. Just click on the next slide, Jamie. The other project that has similar issues is the attempt to restore the island of Floreana. Just go back a couple of slides, Jamie, so we can see where Floreana is on the map of Galapagos. There, at the bottom, it's the smallest of the four islands with a civilian population. That fifth one at the top is just has a military population and an airfield on it. Floreana is the smallest main inhabited island. Now go back to go ahead to there. So that's a picture of the central plateau of Floreana taken from the highest peak, and the map there shows the farms that are there on that central plateau. There aren't many of them because it's a small island and the farms are quite big, but this is a really ambitious project. Click and you'll get another thing appear on there. There you go. So it's a complicated program. It's not really a project, it's a program to restore the island, and that involves projects to eradicate feral cattle and goats, to eradicate rodents, restore the giant tortoise population, enhance some of the key plant populations such as the Opuntia cactus, do some reintroductions, including the Floreana mockingbird, which is only now found on two tiny offshore islets of Floreana and was extinguished by rats. So we have to get rid of the rats before we can reintroduce the mockingbird. So it's a complicated program. It's envisaged to take 20 years, possibly more, to get all this mostly done. The key issue really is this being an inhabited island. A lot of these things affect the inhabitants. So eradicating feral ungulates. People used to hunt them for meat. Eradicating rodents, that's popular, but it uses poison bait drops from helicopters. So people are worried about poison getting into their water supply, all the rest of it. People who've done this kind of work are very familiar with this kind of objection. There's less opposition to the more positive aspects of the restoration program, such as reintroducing giant tortoises. Everyone's in favour of that right from the start. And the same applies to restoring some of the endemic plant populations and reintroducing the mockingbird. But the sticking points nearly always involve the invasive species management aspects of restoration. So or colleagues of mine, I wasn't so personally involved with this one, but we have had a program working with the local population to take into account their concerns, to adapt the project as far as possible, the methods that are used to do this, to protect the investments of the people who live there. So if we're eradicating feral mammals, how do we make sure that the livestock that belongs to the farmers, their domesticated stock, isn't also eradicated in the process? And then how do we manage to keep the domestic stock within limits so that it doesn't, so that we're not facing a renewed problem of feral goats and cattle in the future? So all these things needed to be sorted out with the local population. We couldn't do really anything significant by ourselves as conservationists. We couldn't even do the restoration parts of the program by ourselves, putting back tortoises and enhancing plant populations, etc., because those would not be possible with the presence of the invasive species. We'd have to get rid of the invasive species, the key ones, first before we can do that. So the whole thing hinges on getting the entire population on side. The advantage we have is that it's a small island and there's only fewer than 160 people live on it. So, but still, you have to get them all. And the major part of the program for its first few years was achieving that. And it has been achieved. So this program is underway. The cattle and goats have gone, or pretty much gone. We're still waiting for confirmation in one case. The rodent eradication plan is in its has been developed, and we're looking forward to implementation soon. And the preparations for the restoration programs are also going well. So we hope that this will be a big success. And we have one of the best informed and most positive island populations, positive towards conservation and invasive species management in the world, probably, after all of this work. But it's a big investment. It's been 10 years. Well, it depends where you start looking at this. We've been talking about the project for longer than that, but 10 years of intensive consultation and planning with the population almost before we get going. But that's what it takes, and the payoff can be enormous. This is a very important island with a lot of species endemic just to it, and we need to, if we're going to preserve those in situ, we need to sort these problems out. So that's the kind of thing that we've been doing, and I'm sure lots of you have faced as well. So if anyone wants to ask questions or discuss this a bit further, be happy to hear other people's views.
Thank you very much, Alan. I'm very aware the times through a bit over time and people may be having to disappear off to meetings or getting back into work. There is if you do have a question, then please put your mic on and I'll cue you up. But there is one from Hernan, which is to do with engagement and buy-in process over the long term. And the question is, what would you say is the best approach when, after carrying out the project, the results don't support what local policymakers were expecting from it? So I don't know whether that resonates with you, Alan.
Kind of. I mean, if presumably you mean that the project achieved what it was meant to do, but that didn't satisfy the politicians. And if that's the case, then I suppose it comes down to managing the expectations of the politicians in the first place, to make sure that their expectations are realistic, which is all part of the process of getting all the stakeholders on side when you're making the plan in the first place. And some of the most important stakeholders, obviously, are the politicians whose programs might be affected by what you're trying to do, or whose election prospects might be affected by what you're doing as part of their program. So you need to manage the politicians' expectations, and then the politicians can manage their electorate's expectations. But ideally, all that should be discussed at the planning stage, so that this doesn't come as a surprise towards the end.
I did wonder, Alan, actually, between the two projects, with the Floreana one, would I be right in saying that the local population was involved in setting objectives around the Apuntia, Floreana mockingbird, all the things that you're going to do, those 5 or so lists of sort of core areas of work? Were they involved in developing that, or was that developed and then that was brought to that group?
They were involved in the development. The project in the earliest stages was an idea, and consultations with the local people began when it was still just an idea. So we wanted to make sure that there was. It's all a question of maintaining feasibility, really. We wanted to make sure that we weren't just going off on a tangent that would get nowhere. So we started the discussions with the local community, the local politicians, because there's a level of local government involved there too, to make sure that people were at least cautiously optimistic that this might be a good idea. So it's a case of fighting battles you can win, and being very cautious about the ones that are more difficult. I don't want to encourage people not to undertake projects that are problematic, because this obviously is a problematic project. It's complex, it's very complex, very expensive. It's a large scale thing with lots of components, and you won't really achieve your objective unless you get most of the components right. So it might appear off-putting or too ambitious, but as long as you do it carefully, you take the steps to keep it looking feasible all the way through the planning. And if some problem comes up, you have to recognize, not just put it to one side, but recognize, deal with it now, get over the barrier, and keep the idea feasible at all stages through the planning, all stages of the planning process, really, because it's the plan. Ideally, it's not just a plan which you then stick to. It's something that can be adapted according to what you find along the way, in terms of opportunities that come up that may be suggested by the local population, or barriers that come up generated by people, or always by people in some way, shape or form. So you need to adapt the plan to take care of those. And as long as you're assessing feasibility at every stage of that process, and you're satisfied that you can get over the barriers, that you can take into account people's concerns, then do it.
And that feasibility, and this sort of resonates very much with a sort of CPSG sort of principles, is partly tied up with agreement. You know, that check to ensuring that there is agreement behind what you're ultimately trying to achieve here in this case, with the restoration work, with all those involved. And then as you're going through the process and implementing, then there are other opportunities for ensuring that agreement is still in place. And I wonder, although we've kind of run out of time a bit, I wonder, they're sort of in the 2 case studies that were presented, it was interesting to see with this one, there was the Floreana one could see had a clear, you could imagine a positive future state, whereas at least in the part of the project that you illustrated with the on the other island, which was really to do with removal of incipient populations, that I did wonder if there had been as much effort put into ensuring that the landowners were in agreement that this was, not just a good thing, not a problem for them to, there wasn't going to affect them badly, but they actually were behind the idea of, yes, wouldn't that be wonderful as a goal to have got rid of these things? Or whether actually there was less kind of attention to that agreement around what success really looks like there compared to Floreana. I might be oversimplifying the situation, but I wonder if that was...
No, you're absolutely right. I mean, the Floreana project has an obvious uh, optimum goal of restoring the island to its pristine glory, and all the locals can be proud of that. Whereas the plant eradication projects don't have that sort of attractive endpoint. It's a smaller, more it's like a little piece in the puzzle. Each of those projects is a little piece that contributes to an overall goal of preventing invasions. And prevention is always, it's not as um, kind of visibly attractive goal as removing something and restoring, particularly restoring something, which looks very positive. Whereas the small eradications look as though they're not doing much, and it's more of a negative thing to do, to remove something with a long-term goal of preventing deterioration. Than it is to restore something where you've got an endpoint that you can be so proud of.
Yeah.
So yeah, but again, we talk with that sort of thing over with the people concerned, and people aren't the farmers aren't stupid. They understand this, and also there is a bit of an advantage, or more than a bit. There's an advantage for them too, in that we remove from their properties a plant that's causing problems for them. Most of the farmers that we worked with were on side because their farmland was affected by these invasive species. It's not just the problem that they'll eventually spread into the national park, but they're causing problems for the farmers as well. So everybody's on the same side in a way. But as you say, it's this collateral damage caused by the management of an invasive. In some cases, we were able to offset that by providing the farmers with equipment and materials to be able to manage other invasive species themselves on their land, which, as a kind of compensation for having to put up with the disruption caused by a team coming in there from the outside to manage one particular species. So there are all kinds of angles you can use to ensure cooperation. It's all about cooperation, really, and even the farmers that refused permission for the Cytherexilum on Santa Cruz Island, even they remained on good terms with us. So it's not that we're putting people's backs up. You always really try to avoid that. Try to keep on good terms with people. Don't be conflictive. All this guidance is in the guidelines, but basically try to get people to work together as a team, and that includes everybody who's involved and everybody who's affected by the project.
Thank you, Alan. So I think three words that come to mind in terms of kind of wrapping up is around kind of is to do with trust, it's to do with transparency, and it's to do with agreement from all those involved, alongside the objectivity and the ensuring you're basing your decisions on good information, etc., that you're one's trying to manage. And I think while this is not a topic for this particular webinar, it will be for a future one, where we're thinking about how do you kind of build trust when you're doing so and you're trying to plan for things virtually. And Alan, don't sweat, because I'm not going to try and ask you to on planning for developing plans virtually. It's been great hearing your thoughts on the invasives and that really resonating with that point around clarity of agreement, clarity of goals, etc., that are as important here as they are in any other planning. There's also there is in the chat room, there's a paper that Imagine has pointed to on vertebrate pest management in Palestine. If anyone would be interested, there's a link there to his article on ResearchGate. Alan, can I just say thank you so much for giving up your time and bearing with us on the tech side, and to all participants for doing so as well, and for sharing your insights into invasive species management and planning for them. in particular looking at that stakeholder management. For everybody else, there's the next webinar next month will be given by Phil Seddon, looking at the conservation translocations and planning for conservation translocations. It will touch on the guidelines, those related guidelines as well, and go into a little bit more depth from Phil's experience of doing this work elsewhere. That'll be towards the end of November, but you'll hear more details later on that. Alan, thank you so much indeed for giving up your time. Thanks to everybody for participating. This will be on the website anyway. I wish I could go in and edit the bit where I was getting it wrong on the sharing of screens, etc. You'll have it raw and naked on the website in the not too distant future. But thanks to everyone for participating as well, and look forward to seeing you again.